Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of rock stars of life. I am Katie Brewer, and this is my 20th interview in just under a year since Bandwidth's inception. I would just like to thank all of you for listening and supporting, and in particular to my brilliant guests for giving their time and sharing their stories. It has been an absolute privilege and joy to talk to them, each and every one a true rock star of life. Today's conversation is thanks to New College, Oxford, and my guest is a complete rock star. She is an international best-selling and award-winning writer of fiction, non-fiction, and short stories. She is also a playwright and broadcaster. She has sold more than 8 million copies worldwide in 38 languages and in over 40 countries. She writes for most of the major newspapers and various magazines. She's a regular guest and guest presenter on UK radio and television. She champions women's creativity and is the founder-director of the Women's Prize for Fiction and founder of the Global Women in History campaign. In 2000, she was named European Woman of Achievement for her contribution to the arts. In 2006, her novel Labyrinth was the #1 best-selling title in the UK and a bestseller worldwide. It was awarded the Best Read of the Year at the British Book Awards and has been ranked as one of Waterstone's top 25 books of the past 25 years. In 2012, she won the Spirit of Every Woman Award. In 2013, she was awarded her OBE for services to literature, and in that year and every year since, she has been named as one of publishing's top 100 most influential people. On the 13th of October 2022, which is a week after this podcast will be released, her new book, Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries, How Women Also Built the World, is coming out, a celebration of some of the extraordinary women who built our world and their unsung achievements. Perhaps most importantly of all, she was the captain of the winning team of alumni from New College, Oxford on Christmas Celebrity University Challenge in 2012. The team included fellow novelist Rachel Johnson and former guest on this show, Patrick Gale. I learned in another interview that, like me, she takes a hot water bottle to bed, rain or shine, summer or winter, and I am thrilled to be talking today to Kate Mosse. Kate, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Katie. That was a lovely introduction.
Well, you were born in Chichester, raised in Fishbourne, West Sussex. You're the eldest of 3 sisters. How would you characterise your childhood?
Oh, it's so hard, isn't it? Because my childhood and my sisters, we all have a huge number of shared memories, but also different memories from it. But I would say that this is going to sound annoying, but it was that childhood that you read about in the Janet and John books. We had 2 wonderful parents who loved us and each other. And we had grandparents who came to visit and aunts and uncles. And, we sat down every night together when my dad got home from work and had supper. And we were a very close family. And we had that kind of experience growing up in the 1960s and the 1970s. And it wasn't until I left and went to university that I realized that a lot of people didn't have this kind of incredibly stable background. And it was very quiet background. It wasn't flashy and it wasn't particularly glamorous. We went camping for 2 weeks a year. We went to Devon, or we did go to France once. But it was just that very quintessentially English childhood that, in a way, my father had 30 years before.
Actually had a very similar one. And you're right, you don't realise until you go out into the world how rare it is and how lucky we are. And where did this extraordinary imagination come from? Who inspired it?
I always made up stories. When I became a writer, particularly when I had my first big success, I found myself being interviewed all the time, which I hadn't had that experience before. And I would start off saying, well, no, and I didn't really want to be a writer. I wanted to be a musician and all of these stories. And then my ma would say, darling, that's just not true. You were always writing. And that taught me a really interesting thing about the nature of history and how we tell stories about our own lives, that you kind of impose an order on your upbringing and the way things happened that make it seem purposeful and deliberate and decided upon. But truthfully, we're looking retrospectively. Now, I did always write stories. I was obsessed with, in those days, as they would be called, Eskimos, completely obsessed with Scott of the Antarctic, ignoring the fact that many of these things were not happening in the same part of the world at all. And my girls, when I was at school, I was at a big comprehensive school in Sussex, said, oh no, but don't you remember you always writing plays, making everybody make their own costumes? And I think I did have a lot of dolls, but what I did with the dolls was make plays. I was never pretending to be a mother. I didn't have a pram. I was very much, making them move about and speak to each other. So I think it's many people listening, and you obviously had the same, Katie. I had a bedtime story read to me every night. There were lots of books about. And I would say other things like quite old-fashioned things. We went to church on Sunday. You are therefore in places, and we went to the theatre. You're in places where there is requirement of imagination to engage. When you sit in a very, very cold pew in a village church and you're listening to words that you don't understand, what is it that keeps you awake through that process when you're a child? And it's looking at the glass, and it's looking at the candles, and also understanding that there is something being talked about that is bigger than you as a 6-year-old sitting on a pew in a church. And I think all of these things are about what feed imagination.
I think that what's so lovely about when we were growing up is there were fewer distractions. So you could have that time for your mind to wander, which perhaps people of this generation don't have so much.
Well, I think they have to make an active decision to seek peace. And a great deal of imagination comes from being bored. And so you make your own entertainment and your own thoughts and your own games and your own characters and imaginary friends and all of these kind of things. And it's why, now I walk a lot, like a lot of novelists do and writers do. A lot of us find it's much easier to think away from your desk than at it. But I've never listened, forgive me, to podcasts or music or any of these things when I'm walking. I deliberately try to silence the very, very noisy world, which is everybody is on all of the time. And there's a great deal of intrusion into everybody's personal space. We're recording this the day after the Queen has died. And you can just see that people need some silence to absorb these things and not have constantly images being thrown at them and all of that kind of thing. So I think it's really important that we seek peace, that we seek the peace in the landscape, and we protect ourselves, actually.
Well, I have 3 whys for you. Why Oxford? Why New College? And why English?
I thought you said I've got 3 wives for you.
Oh, yeah.
I thought we are plummeting into incredibly complicated territory before we've really got out the blocks. Yes. Well, with Oxford, my parents grew up in the war. My ma was a child, and my dad was sitting with his mother and father and big brother and big sister on the 3rd of September 1939 in the Lake District, and heard the announcement, Chamberlain announced that we were now at war with Germany. And he signed up as soon as he could, which was a couple of years later. So they didn't go to university. They didn't have any of those opportunities. And my mother didn't come from that sort of environment, and my father was a soldier. So I'd never ever been to Oxford, but it was that place in my mind. It was never Cambridge. It was always, I had this idea of Oxford in my mind as being somewhere absolutely exceptional. And I applied. And the very first time I went there was the day of my interview. Never set foot in Oxford until I went for the interview. And my lovely dad gave me this wonderful piece of advice. And he said, the thing is, darling, if you look like you deserve to be there and you know what you're doing, people will assume you do. And it's not about being arrogant or telling people what you're doing, or any of those things. It's more about when you first get to New College, you just walk confidently through the Porter's Lodge and into the, you first get in there and you see it. And then when you're walking through to the old garden and all of these kind of things, just look as if you can see yourself there. And it was a wonderful piece of advice, because I really hadn't been in Oxford, let alone inside a college. And of course, we all know, I don't know how it works quite nowadays, but we've all had that experience where you suddenly find yourself climbing up a cold and not very well lit staircase. And are you at the right place? And you knock on the door and there's beautiful lettering and blackboards and white names. And all of those things are a very, very long cry from a 2,000 strong girls' comprehensive school in Chichester. But at the same time, they weren't, because my parents had just brought us up to be confident and be ourselves and go for what we wanted to do. New College, why New College was an embarrassing thing to say, but because I was not, I was, as I said, a big comprehensive school. So we weren't being tutored or prepared for exams. I was working my gap year as a waitress in the cafe, and then I did the exams. And I applied to New College because I thought it was a new college and I would have a better chance of getting in than one of the old colleges that I knew had got closed scholarships and were very tight. Now, of course, New College in those days was one of the three that did still have closed scholarships, in New College's case to Winchester. But I've always thought that actually that turned out to be an advantage in the end, because I think New College, like many of the colleges, but I would say New College has been doing incredibly well on this, particularly recently under the current warden, trying to be more representative of the country as a whole. Most of us don't go to fee-paying schools. A huge number of us do not go to fee-paying schools, but yet the representation within Oxford, when I was up there, was very poor. And New College was very poor for state pupils. There were only 12 of us, I think. I mean, really. An archivist will tell me it was more than that, but that was just how it was, And so I actually think that because I didn't really know what I was doing, and I turned up at this place, and I did look around thinking, this is great. I liked the scale of it and the size of it, that actually that probably stood me in good stead, because I wasn't actually not competing, but I wasn't competing against like-minded people. And then I met, when I got there and I met all these people, and it was another amazing lesson, which was I met people who'd been at those top schools, so-called, who had enormous privilege in the way that we now would use that word, and there'd been expectation. And what I learned was that my parents believed in everything I did and were proud of what I did. And I would meet these lovely young women and men, many of the men with brideshead visited, floppy fringes and all.
Yes, I remember those.
And they were carrying the scars of the only thing they could do to distinguish themselves was to fail, because their father had gone there, their father before them, everybody had got the equivalent of 4 A's and all the rest of it. And I remember very clearly on almost my first day, somebody saying, "Here, well, I only got 3 A's and a B." I thought, now that is really interesting, that in that world, you are carrying a sense of failure. And it's the same thing. So you learn lessons about your upbringing and how things are often only when you go out into the world. So that was my New College journey. And then I got in, and they were the most fantastic years. I had a brilliant time. I'm very proud of being a New College person.
And how did you feel your time when you were there? Were you very conscientious, or were you out doing other things?
I kind of felt I'd really achieved by getting there. In those days, you did queue up on a Friday night for one of the 2 pay phones to call home. So you were very cut off. It's completely different now. But that also is quite a character forming moment. I had grown up, lived at home, worked in a cafe in my gap year, didn't go traveling off around India. I was, all of those things, did a secretarial course, and then went to New College and saw my parents once a term. And so that was really shocking. And you couldn't just ring up and say, "Come and get me and come and see me." The Newby Boy bypass had not been built then, apart from anything else. It took a long time to get to Sussex. But what I did was I did theatre was my main engagement, I suppose. I was joined out straight away and was very much part of putting on shows every term and all of that, both New College Society, but also university-wide.
And were you acting in them or writing them?
No, it's a great sadness to me that I have no acting skill. I would have loved to be able to sing and dance and act. My son is actually an actor in music theatre, and my daughter is in art, but she was very interested in dance. I was behind the scenes person. I kind of producer, stage managing, the bossy one. And I loved that. But I think the most significant thing that happened really for me at Oxford was feminism. And having grown up in the environment I did, and going to an all-girls comprehensive school with 2,000 pupils, a lot of the things that are utterly self-evident about the fact that the world is not equal in terms of girls and boys' opportunities and experiences were quite hidden from me. So I lived in a very female world, and I had 2 parents who just adored us. So when I got to university, in a way, it felt like my eyes were opened. And the problem is, of course, once your eyes are opened, you can't shut them again. So I little by little got more involved, and so was part of feminist groups. They were consciousness raising groups, they were called, in the CR. Took part in a lot of campaigning, particularly in those days. The kind of the touch topic was pornography and sex working and all of those things. And it was the era of Reclaim the Night marches. And that was apart from the friends that I made at New College and in Oxford, who are still some of my closest friends, I would say that kind of political awakening was very significant for me. And I came out of Oxford, knowing a lot more about the world than when I went in.
And did you go straight then from university to Hodder and Stoughton?
Yes, because I thought I wanted to work in theatre, but then I realised that actually what I did in theatre in the professional world was simply about raising money, and that didn't appeal to me. You know, I liked being backstage and around the artists, and I also knew that I couldn't act, but I really, as you can tell, I really like talking. I'm very good on the stage. It's just I can be myself on stage. I can't inhabit other people on stages. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. I left thinking, well, I don't know what I want to do. In those days, it didn't matter whether you'd got a degree from Oxford or whatever. Most girls did a secretarial course, and I had done one before I went to university. So I'm a proper trained typist and shorthand. And so I just signed up with a temp agency, and on the first day I was set to a publishing company called Hodder and Stoughton. I was temping on reception, and then I did a couple of days temping for one of the editors, and then his secretary, while I was there, announced she was going to get married and leave straight away. And he said, well, do you want the job? I thought, well, yeah, why not? I'm here. I don't know what else would I want to do.
And when did you then first think that you would like to be, or you could be, a writer?
I never really ever thought that. It wasn't something I wanted to do, actually. When I'm talking, particularly if I'm talking to younger people, my belief is that, obviously, if you want to be a doctor or an architect, you have to do the right exams in the first place, and you have to go to the right kind of training and those kind of things. There's no training for being a writer, not in the same sort of way. And so I suppose my policy about life and career has always been be open to the opportunities. So if someone says, hey, do you want the job? Say, okay, give it a go. So there's been very little deliberate in my career. It's been about, there's been this particular moment, something could be done, let's do it. And so for me with writing, while I was publishing, I did enjoy being a publisher, but I was doing a lot of trade union work. I was, within the NUJ, and then was in fact chair of the book branch of the NUJ. And a lot of that was negotiating. It was about maternity provision. It was about, parental leave, carers leave, all of this kind of stuff. And I enjoyed all of that. So I was really at the back of my mind thinking, do I want to run for Parliament? Do I want to be an MP? And, I haven't entirely said no to that, even though I'm now, nearly 61.
Plenty of time.
Plenty of time. That sort of sense of, my parents were people who thought that you put stuff back in. They believed in public service. I think that's why a lot of us are feeling and are surprising ourselves to feel so very weepy about the Queen died, which is that extraordinary example of service to other people. And I was brought up in that framework. And so that was really what I was thinking. And then what happened was I was having lunch with an agent friend who has indeed been my agent ever since. And I was expecting my second child. And I said, it's very odd. The book that I wanted to read, that I needed to read when I was pregnant for the first time, it wasn't there then. And now I'm pregnant again, it's still not there. And he said, well, why don't you stop moaning and write it? And I said, I will then. And then I tell the story that the next day he rang up. He says it was a couple of days than that. But essentially he rang up and said, I've got the contract for you with Virago to write this feminist pregnancy book. And then, of course, I dared myself. So I had to have a go. And then I discovered that I really enjoyed writing it because obviously it mirrored my pregnancy. And then I was asked to write another nonfiction book. And out of that, another publisher said, although these are nonfiction books, really, it's all about the characters. Have you ever thought about writing fiction? I said, I'll give it a go. It's an annoying story for people, but it is also the truth of the story. It wasn't that I had this burning desire to be a writer. It's just that have a go. And then it turned out I could do that.
Did you leave publishing and move straight to Carcassonne, or did that happen?
No. The chronology is slightly different in that I was in publishing and I had my daughter Martha, and who herself had her first baby 2 days ago. So I'm
oh my goodness,
a brand new granny
congratulations.
as we're talking, and starry-eyed with that, actually.
And how are they both?
Quite extraordinary. Had baby at lunchtime. I was very, very anxious. I had a women's prize meeting, and I knew my beloved daughter was in labour. I obviously was checking my phone all of the time. I then had another incredibly important meeting, and it was torrential rain going on. And so where else would you go? And I was just wandering through London, and I thought, well, I'm just going to have to go and sit in Foyles or something, because this is all absolutely too much to cope with, actually, not knowing what's happening and is it all okay. And so then went into Foyles and just sat down on a bench feeling very tired, because I've been up all night because, obviously because of that.
Yes.
And then I got a message from my son-in-law saying he's arrived. And so then I completely lost it in I rang my husband and my son, and they couldn't hear what I was saying, but they kind of worked it out, I guess. And then this lovely old lady next to me just leant over and said, "My dear, this is happy news." I was a complete meltdown. Anyway, the point about that digression was that my husband and my wonderful mother-in-law, Granny Rosie, those of you who read An Extra Pair of Hands will know I'm her carer and will know what an extraordinary woman she is. They got on a train to go to Carcassonne in August 1989 to see about buying a little house in Carcassonne. And I didn't go with them because I carried on the train to go and tell my parents we were expecting a baby, and that baby was Martha. So that was the timescale. So Carcassonne was there from 1989 onwards. And I left publishing when I was pregnant with my son. So that was in January 1990. And I can remember that very clearly because I went to the very first meeting to talk about the Women's Prize in a flat in North London on a cold January evening. And I walked in, and this is publishing in the 80s, was immediately given a glass of wine. And I went to drink, and I thought, oh no. And went home and took a pregnancy test, and it was like, So all of these things, the prize, starting to become a writer, started to be inspired by the history of Carcassonne, leaving publishing, all of these things were happening at about the same sort of time, which looking back, it just seems extraordinary, but it didn't feel that at the time. I went there for the first time in November 1989 when I was 6 months pregnant. And we got off the train in Carcassonne, and it was November, and therefore it was cold and wet. And everybody who knows France will know that out of season, at 7:01, everything empties. There's nobody about. You just hear kind of footsteps in the distance. And we walked through the modern town, the Bastide, which is 14th century, and up onto the Pont Vieux, and I saw the medieval citadel for the first time. And it was a coup de foudre. That was it. I just fell in love. And more than just falling in love, thought, oh, I see, I belong here. It was just this visceral feeling, just like I understand this place. And so then it was a place where we spent the summers and Easter holidays with our 2 little children. And I didn't intend to write about it, but little by little, there was the thing that is how I always describe writing a novel for me. It's like, it's the whispering in the landscape. Place comes first for me, and the combination, that kind of particular alchemy of history and place. Characters and story come later, and being there and hearing this whispering in the landscape, and then thinking, oh, I have a story to tell here. And the story took 6 years to find me, but it did. And I didn't start writing till a lot later, not till 2003.
One of the things I found extraordinary, Kate, about your novels is that you have these sort of roots in historical fact and the level of detail that you have, so that not only do you talk about a particular room and the furniture that would be in it, but then you go into what would be inside the furniture, what you'd find. It's extraordinary, that level of detail. And then you have these slightly mystical plots that then stretch your imagination. But because they're so firmly rooted in all these historical facts, you feel safe to go there. And that's what's just so gripping and so enchanting and sort of mind stretching. So when you find this place, do you then just research and research and research, and as you research, ideas come? Or
yes, it's you kind of put your finger on it. It's exactly what happened. So when Carcassonne, I then of course I'm reading all the history about Carcassonne, and particularly reading about it's become known, the Cathar Crusade of 1209 and 1244, and so I'm learning the history, and so it's kind of like a palimpsest. When I walk around Carcassonne, I'm there as myself with my, in those days, little children. I'm also there in the footsteps of the author of the book that I'm reading. And then what I'm seeing is several layers beneath that, the echo of the people that walked there in 1209. So for me, it always feels like building a stage set, but the research and the deep immersion in history, and I love history, obviously, is about building the stage set. It's about getting the props. It's about getting the backdrop and the psych and all of this kind of thing. And then there's a moment at which, so I know the real history and I have the timeline and the arc. Then the question is, where are my actors? And I tend to just start writing, just to see what comes out. And there's always a moment when the lead character will be, if you like, everybody standing in the wings, and then people making their entrances, coming on. And then there's a moment at which the lead character kind of steps in front of me and turns around, and it's usually a her, but not always. And we'll put out her hand and say, here I am, off we go together with this. I don't know if anybody's listening, never seen the stage musical of Les Mis. My son is in music theatre and has played Marius many times on and off. And it's that bit, empty chairs at empty tables, when he's just on the empty stage, and then suddenly all of those ghosts of those boys are next to him. And that is what it feels like for me when I'm writing. So I meet, with my new series of novels, Minou, with Labyrinth, it was Alaïs, with Citadel, which is in a way the one that I have most affection for, which is an imagined true story of the women of the Carcassonne resistance, Sandrine. And it's everything about how they are named, never decide. But when I started to write Citadel and was writing this story, there had been a piece of graffiti on the wall by the canal in Carcassonne, well, the river Aude in Carcassonne. And I loved it because it was the priggishness of the punctuation being correct. So somebody had in huge letters spray painted Sandrine, comma, je t'aime. And it was the comma that just did it for me every time. And so the minute I started writing, I didn't ever decide my lead character was going to be Sandrine. She just was Sandrine. I knew that it was going to be the name. So it's very organic, I suppose, in terms of there isn't a starting point. There's many, many things that come together. And then all you hope for with every book is that there will be a moment at which the book takes flight.
Do you write a skeleton of a plot, or do you just literally write and it's full and it's chapter one and it goes?
I just go. I do all my research really before I start writing, because I write adventure fiction. Everything is about momentum and jeopardy and pace. So if you're trying to capture that on the page for your reader, you can't be saying, oh, hang on a second, I better go and check what type of shoes they're wearing.
Yeah.
No, I need to know all of that. And daft things like, if there's much death and many chase scenes in my novels, as you know, I need to know what a woman's wearing. Can she run? How big are her skirts really? All of this stuff, everything about the research is about how it feeds the story, how it informs the plot. So when I do sit down and start writing the first draft, and I'm in that process at the moment, I always think of the first draft as being all emotion. Just sit down and I go. And I don't go back over it. And I don't think, oh, that chapter's rubbish, I better rewrite it. I just keep going until I've got a first draft, because I don't feel you really know what book you're writing till you've got a first draft. It's like, when I'm talking to schools, I always say it's like you can't start decorating your house until you've got all four walls and the roof. Then you can choose the paint. That is how it feels like for me. And the second draft is therefore kind of all intellect. And it's saying, this beginning doesn't work. In my case, it's usually, how many dead priests do you need, Kate? You've got more than you need. Always a lot of old women, more old women than I need, so I'm just kind of writing the people that come to me. And then the second is the kind of intellect going, that doesn't work, this needs to be moved, you need to start in a different place. And then I do a third draft, which is, okay, now I know the story I'm telling. I know the people who are telling the story for me. Now I can kind of knock this book into shape, the book it should be, that it has to be, because stories, they know what they need. Some are very spare and elegant. Mine are not usually that. They're so big and blousy, but it's all of that kind of stuff. And I'm at that process with my current novel at the moment, which is, I love the beginning because it's a key piece of history and very important. But now I've got the first draft, I'm thinking, do the readers need to know all this history though? I'm passionate about it and I know a lot of people, but in terms of this story, how much of this do we really need to know? And that's very hard to say goodbye to a lot of that.
Yeah, that must be incredibly hard when you know so much. Is that the Joubert Family Chronicles?
Yes, exactly.
That's the third one.
The third one, which is called The Ghost Ship. It's basically lesbian pirates. That's all you need to know. That's the selling line. That's not going to be the selling line. We're going into the age of piracy, and also we're going into the age of a lot of social change and quite a lot of women deciding to live as men.
Right, which is understandable.
Understandable. So, yeah.
I have to just tell you, because I read Labyrinth earlier on this year, and it was just a testament to how much I loved it and I just couldn't put it down. And I was trekking with some 10 ladies. We were in the Himalayas, and in the evenings we were in these tea houses and they were freezing. And so you'd have to get into these your rooms, and you'd have to sort of lay everything out and take a deep breath and change because it was so
Oh,
cold. And
God.
then I would get in with my long johns and everything, my woolly hat, get into it, hot water bottle, very important, super important there. And then I would have Labyrinth, and I would have my hand sticking out of my sleeping bag. And my friend said, who was in the next door bed to me, she said, "Well, forget it. I'm not reading. It's too cold, and my hand's going numb." But I was so into Labyrinth. I thought, I need to know what's going to happen to Alais. I need to know what's happening to Alice. And so I sort of had this hand swapping ritual so that when one got too numb, I could then use the hot water bottle and have the other one. But it was just fantastic.
That is adorable to hear. And also properly in the spirit of those warrior women, you know, in the Himalayas, freezing in, a kind of cabin. This is proper. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about these warrior women.
And then it became a two-part mini-series, which I watched, and you're in it at the end. That's
I
you,
am
isn't it? You're the tour guide.
finally get my acting. And it was very funny being the tour guide up in Mosse, because firstly, we had to carry all the equipment up a mountain, which if you've been hiking in the Himalayas,
That's no mean feat.
no mean feat, with all the camera people carrying all this stuff on their back. And then, of course, the extras, bless them, are French. So I'm standing there giving a lecture in English about Montségur with people. But it was the most exciting moment when they said, "And that's a wrap for Kate." And it was just, tiny little moment, my Peter Jackson moment and my Hitchcock moment. But it was very exhilarating to be there. What was mostly wonderful about filming was how almost every single extra that you see are people who live in Carcassonne that we've known for years, who work in cafes, and the postman's in it, and the lovely guys that were at that stage worked on the bins. Somehow it was like, "Sure, I recognized you." And they said, "Oh no, it can be very difficult and expensive filming in France." And they weren't going to. We were going to film it all in South Africa. But they just did a bit of research and realized that people just really cared about the novel. And I've always been very grateful for that Carcassonne treats me like a local author, as opposed to, what a cheek this English woman's come over and is writing our history.
2 years later, after Labyrinth, you write Sepulchre, and I love that so much. I think I enjoy the characters even more because I love the whole tarot haunting and contemporary Meredith you have versus the spirited Leonie. It was just mesmerizingly good. And I just wondered, do you believe in tarot?
Well, now the thing is, I get asked this a lot about, do I believe in ghosts as well, obviously, because I write a lot of ghost stories. And I always evade it because my job is to make you believe in it.
Yeah, which you did.
That's the thing. So with tarot, with my logical hat on, do I believe that a person sitting in a room in Covent Garden in London will turn over cards that tell you about? No. I read English at New College, as you know. That amazing line in Paradise Lost: "Sufficient to have stood, yet free to fall." So do I believe there is a path and we have no control? No, I don't. But it is the same as with ghosts or with reincarnation or any of those kind of things. There is always that tiny, tiny thing that just says, we don't know. We don't know. And I went to have a tarot reading because I really felt I had to have had that experience myself. And I was very honest. So I went in off the street, and I was wearing, my normal, utterly plain, I wasn't dressed up to go to work or do anything. And I don't wear a wedding ring and all of these kind of things. I went in off the street and I said, "I'm writing a book that has got tarot in it, and I'd like to see how it works. So I don't want to be dishonest. I'd love a reading, but it is research for me." And she was great and said, "Yes, absolutely, of course." So she didn't even have my surname. She just, because I did walking off the street. And I realized I was kind of doing that as a test, I suppose, so that there weren't things that might give me away, or because that's always the thing about, whether it's seances or tarot or any of these kind of things, is, yeah, but they can do the research on you, so they can find all of these things. The moment she said, "Right, you can turn over the first card," my heart went through the roof of my mouth. I mean, I felt this huge, like,
Really?
I don't want to engage with this. And that's what I say when I'm writing about ghosts. It's, do I believe in ghosts? Well, sitting, I don't know what it's like where you are, but the sun is shining today, and this has been a momentous week in so many ways, but, everything's green again and it's beautiful, and it's, if I'm on my own on a path in on the Fishbourne Marshes or in Carcassonne, there is always that sense of that turn on the stair, if you like, or just that something slightly beyond your sight line, that movement. And when my parents died, I loved my parents very much. When I walked around, I felt they were there. So all of these things for me come under the heading of, if you think of all the things that are miraculous that we now understand, that even 50 years ago were incomprehensible, surely it makes sense that there is so much more that we don't understand. And I find that comforting. I don't feel I need to know the answers. I feel that my job as a writer is to ask the questions.
I was completely believed every word. Anyway, 2009, you write The Winter Ghost. 2012, Citadel comes out, that trilogy. Was that the plan right from the beginning, or did that just emerge?
It just emerged. I wrote Labyrinth, and then I felt I'm not done with Carcassonne. So then I wrote Sepulchre, and then I finally wrote Citadel. And I realized I still wasn't done with Carcassonne, because the Joubert Family Chronicles, obviously when I had an idea for a huge book about the Huguenot diaspora and what it meant to be a refugee and what it meant to carry your home in your heart, where did I go and start the story? Of course, the inspiration was being in South Africa and being at the Huguenot Museum and seeing the land there. But of course, I went straight back to Carcassonne because I thought my heart belongs there. And even with the one I'm writing at the moment, which got no business to be going anywhere near Carcassonne, I found myself, it's going to get sucked back. So it's the place that made me a writer. Being in Carcassonne made me a writer. So it's just terribly fundamental from that point of view. If I'd been planning those books as a trilogy, I would have done things differently. Not least of all, I would have kind of worked out everybody's ages slightly better, and it's that kind of thing. Whereas the Joubert Family Chronicles is all I start at the end, and I know that I'm working there. The only thing that's happening there is that it's clearly not going to be 3 books, because I barely got out of the 16th century. So that's the problem with me. My math is never strong. And I found it very liberating to start with the Joubert Family Chronicles, because the idea that I was going to be in the company of these people for a while. Then I started to find it quite claustrophobic, which was interesting. And I've therefore written 2 non-fiction books in between.
I would love to talk to you about The Taxidermist Daughter, because that's obviously set in Fishbourne, and I reread it this summer. I read it years ago. You grew up there, and so interesting that you went back and then wrote about the place where you grew up. And the way that you describe that flooding, Connie, and with the water rising and the rain falling. I mean, I felt I was her, actually, by the end.
Right.
With her. How on earth did you come up with that plot? Because it's so twisty, it's so clever, it's so neat.
It's so funny. I am, despite everything, basically an optimistic and cheerful person, despite everything. And what most people have said about Taxidermist Daughter, it's like, we had no idea you had it in you, because it's so dark. Partly it's that dark because these are all made up stories. That is the story that I wanted to tell. And it's a story of revenge. It's a story of what can a woman do if there will be no justice? Is it ever justifiable to take the law into your own hands? And if so, how much is too much? I mean, I think anybody would probably agree that Cassie in the Taxidermist Daughter does go a bit far. But at the same time,
you can understand why.
That's right. The very people who should be protecting her are the ones that are responsible for the crime. Does this sound familiar?
Yes.
So these are very dark things that are in every culture and every type of society and don't go away. So it was inspired, however, by the fact that my sisters and my parents would take us in the 1970s to Walter Potter's Museum of Taxidermy. By this stage, it had started in a place called Bramber outside Brighton, and then it had moved to Arundel, which is a cathedral city nearby, near to Chichester. And I loved the Taxidermy Museum. And it's very odd because I don't think I consciously realized that they were dead animals. I think he did this extraordinary thing, which is turn them into tableaus, so they were all telling stories. It didn't look really very different from a display of cuddly toys in Hamleys, frankly, except obviously they were formerly alive. And the thing that's even more weird is that I was a vegetarian from the age of 7 or 8. I just hated the idea of putting a dead thing in my mouth. So by everything that's right, I should have been far too squeamish for any of this, but I wasn't. My sisters later, when I wrote Taxidermist Daughter, told me that they had nightmares about the museum. They hated going to the museum and were really furious that I'd be going, I know, it's raining, let's go to the Taxidermist Museum. Off we went. So that was, I did want to write something about that. And also the extraordinary thing about taxidermy, that it's the great unsung craft of the Victorian era. For all sorts of reasons, it gets very tied up with big game hunting, which obviously is abhorrent, all of these kind of things. But actually, it was incredibly important. It was the one piece of art that every middle-class household would have. And, I wanted to write about that. And therefore, the story came together, the idea of taxidermy and then human taxidermy. And before you knew it, there was a Gothic horror story. And, I adapted it for Chichester Festival Theatre this year. It was a great honour that it opened the 60th anniversary season, the first new play by a living woman on the main stage.
Oh my goodness. And how easy was that? Because you're then stripping out all your descriptions and actions, and it's just dialogue, which I think it's almost easier to write a screenplay from the start than change it.
It was extremely hard. I had to tell the same story in a different way, and audiences absolutely loved it, local audiences in particular. I'm writing a new play at the moment, and it's so much easier writing a play than adapting a very complicated novel, because it's like, how do you explain recovered memories? How do you explain, two different storylines all coming to the same point? How do you do the flashbacks? I had an amazing creative team, incredible design by Paul Wills and lovely direction by Roisin McBrien. Somebody said it's like opera without the music. And that was exactly it. It had a hugely big and visceral thing. And we did stuff on the stage. The killing didn't all happen off stage, which is always a challenge as well. But it was the most amazing experience. And there was a real beauty for the audiences that they would come out of the theatre and then were in the landscape of the play. And lots of people went to the marshes, having done it. They went to the church and they walked around the marshes, and they did, and wanted to be in that particular kind of landscape, because the play is set in April and May, and we opened in April. So every bit of description that, of course, I put in the book was there on the screens or on the stage. Just the beginning of the hedgerows, coming back into colour. And that was an amazing experience when you went into the theatre and you could see reeds moving and the water sort of shimmering. It was really, just even thinking about it, it was a wonderful experience. And for a month, I felt like the Queen of Chichester, in that everywhere I went, people would come up and go, "Oh, I saw your play." And lots of people for whom theatre is not their main interest went because it was written about Fishbourne. It was local. And so that was a great experience. You just thought, yeah, this is why we write books. This is why we go to the theatre. This is why we listen to music, because it joins us all in this collective act, if you like. And normally I don't see thousands of people sitting reading one of my books in one go. When you go to the theatre, I tell you, there is nothing like that. When you go in and you look around at all those people and you think, they've all come to see this tonight. It's just a very different experience being a playwright from being a novelist, really very different.
After The Taxidermist's Daughter, you will then have the Joubert series. And I was so lucky, because when I realized I was going to be talking to you, I happened on the day that I got the email, I was going on holiday, and I thought, well, that's fine, because Kate Mosse is always in the top 10. So I'll just go and get her book from the airport. And sure enough, there you were, City of Tears. And you tackle something very difficult. I think one of the most awful things that can happen to a person is losing a child and not knowing what has happened to them. I wondered whether you talked to people who had gone through that experience to create that character.
What was very interesting about City of Tears is, it's the second in the Joubert Family Chronicles. All of the books can be read as standalones as well. And that was very important. And I spent a lot of time making that possible. And when I started, it was, there was going to be the key moment of the French Wars of Religion, which is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre after the Third War. And it's a marriage has been brokered between Catherine de Medici and Jeanne d'Albret, that they will marry their children. So Huguenot Henry of Navarre and Marguerite de Valois, the daughter of the Queen. And so it's a fascinating period of history, because it's two incredibly strong women saying, enough now, enough. And France was being bankrupted by the wars, and it continued on, obviously, for a long time afterwards, another 20 years odd. So that was really all I knew, that my family, Mounou and the family, would go to Paris, and they would be there on that historic occasion of the wedding, and then would be there on the night of the massacre. But the question as a writer of fiction is, but what's their story? Because being there is not a story. That's not a story. And so I didn't really know. And I didn't know who was going to make it out alive. And I didn't know who was going to disappear in the night of the massacre. And as I started to write and I started to write, and I just thought, oh, this is a lost child story. That really took me by surprise. And it's hard to write that kind of story. So no, I didn't talk to anybody or whatever, but I don't think anybody has been in the UK in particular in the last 20 years will have escaped the enormous coverage over Madeleine McCann. There are many other children, Ben Needham, lots of children who have disappeared, and some children are given a lot more prominence to their loss than others. And that's a whole other story, obviously. But I think the thing that I always felt when I saw those parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, on the television was that it was the not knowing that was killing them. It's not that it would have been good to know that their daughter was dead, but it was the not knowing. And so I think that must have always been in there. Just the question, I think we all ask ourselves, what would we do? I am a parent. You do ask yourself, what would you do if your child disappeared? You just don't know actually how you'd react. But within fiction, of course, Minu can only behave as herself and Pete can only behave as himself. And none of them are me. But it's about how you come to terms with loss. And I have, of course, like all of us, friends who have lost children. And I have lost my parents, which is completely different, but have felt deep grief in those. And of course, friends now. And so I think often when you're writing fiction, you are simply saying, what would I do in this circumstance? How would I cope? Would I cope? That is, I suppose, what I'm writing to find out what's going to happen as much as the reader's reading to find out what's going to happen. It was also important to me that it isn't always straightforward, the story, because Minu and Pete, as the parents who for 12 years don't know what's happened to their child, are in purgatory every day about that, and they deal with it differently. Their child is fine. And if only they knew. But I think that's quite important because the rest of the narrative is always that it will have been terrible, but not necessarily. So that was also quite interesting to write. And she was a character I really enjoyed writing about her.
Coming out in the next couple of weeks, you have Warrior Queens and Quiet Revolutionaries. It's a work of non-fiction in amongst the Joubert family chronicles, and it's a celebration of nearly 1,000 incredible women from the past. So it's warriors, writers, inventors, scientists, women of conviction, women of courage. Also a detective story about your great-grandmother, Lily Watson, in whose footsteps you unknowingly have walked or are walking. And I actually thought it was extraordinary because having read Labyrinth and Sepulchre, where you have two protagonists, both strong women, both related, connected, so many parallels in their lives. And you wrote that before you knew that you had a great-grandmother. So what was the catalyst of that book?
I love this book. It's quite hard to categorize because, as you say, there are lots of wonderful books celebrating women who've been left out of history. And it is that, although it is very comprehensive.
It's encyclopedic, almost.
Yes, it really, really is. And I'm sure I wouldn't have had time to write it if I hadn't been in lockdown. I think that's also part of it. So what happened was that I was publishing The City of Tears and nothing was going to happen. We were in lockdown. It was a book that I was really proud of. I love going out and about and doing bookshop events and meeting readers, and nothing was going to happen. So I just thought, well, I need to market in some way for myself. And so had an online Zoom launch party, which was, fun. Not as much fun as being in the room, but it was the best we could do in January, 2021. And I simply said there and asked a few friends, I said, tell me the one woman from history who you just want to celebrate or you really think should be better known. So it was almost a throwaway comment. And various friends were kind enough to join in and, made some suggestions. And then I just turned it into a social media thing and just put out on social media, tell me the one woman in history. And the key thing about this book is it is about celebrating. It's not about complaint. It's a book about how history is made and who gets to write it. It's a book about how if you don't preserve things, then they're not there to be found. And that's how easy it is for women to disappear from history. And I put this out on social media, and within days, I think because people were feeling very depressed, and this was just, say, a celebratory thing, thousands of people from all over the world were sending in their recommendations. And it was exhilarating and wonderful. And we all needed something good, didn't we, to be kind of getting behind at that stage. And then I just started to think, I think there's a book in this. Question is, if only a small number of people write history, they will almost inevitably simply write about what they think matters. And therefore, the huge majority of human experience will not be included. And so, obviously, having worked as a historical writer of fiction with female-led fiction all of these years, it's very straightforward. You see that in every time people have the idea that women only sat around with a bit of embroidery and the men were out doing all the stuff. That's not common sense. The more you research, you realize that this simply never was true. But the way the history is written about it tells a different story. And why does it matter? Because history is quite often used to justify oppression and bigotry in the present day on the basis of it's always been like that. And we are seeing that in many parts of the world at the moment. Also, as a feminist of my age, these are not good times for women in many ways. Things are actually going backwards in some cases. And much of the dialogue is very challenging and aggressive. And this, of course, is what happens when the world is in difficulty. This is not unusual. So I felt, this book, firstly, will celebrate lots of incredible women and lots of fun. So it gives me, as you can imagine, enormous pleasure to have discovered that a woman invented the dishwasher. You kind of think, really?
Of course.
Yeah, just after Christmas in the 1880s in America, Josephine Cochrane said, you know what? I have had enough. I'm going to build, So there's lots of wonderful facts. And there's also some really pretty sobering facts and very depressing facts. And history is a pendulum. It goes backwards and forwards. And of course, the thing is that we will return to a much safer place. But at the moment, the pendulum is swinging very far in the wrong direction. And it's happening everywhere. And so for me, with this book, I was asking myself, firstly, the question of let's just put names back out there so that every single time someone says to you, but there aren't any women classical music composers, that's why they're never performed. You go, well, if I might refer my learned friend to this book. So it is a celebration and it's beautifully designed because I want it to be the sort of book that every mum gives to their son and every dad gives that to their daughter, that it's not a book to be read page to page like a novel. It's you dip in, you dip out. And there's lots of, I just love giving facts and people go, oh, I never knew that. That's extraordinary. But the bigger question is, my great-grandmother was, in her day, a really well-known novelist, it turns out. I did know that my grandmother wrote some books, but it was very much presented like she wrote some books. She now is invisible. She was a bestseller. All of her books are out of print. She doesn't appear in any dictionaries. She doesn't appear on Wikipedia. That's another one, discovering that, I will, the figures change, but basically 90% of entries on Wikipedia are written by men. So immediately you start to see how things get skewed. And, we have this with the Women's Prize, that women read books by women and novels by women and men tend to read books by men. So if women choose equally half and half and men only choose men, you suddenly end up completely statistically wrong for the number of books that are being published and written by women. So it's about being aware of this thing. But I asked myself, how can it be if someone like my great-grandmother, who was privileged middle-class white woman living in London born in 1849, died in 1932, had all of these books in print, was very comfortably off. If she can have vanished completely from the record, what about all the other women? That really is what got me going. My second cousin found a deed box of letters, 500 letters between my great granny and her husband. And this was discovered 2 weeks before the book was due to be delivered.
Oh my gosh.
So on the one hand, it's the moment that you dream of. It was like last Christmas. It was like, oh my God. And, some of them were nibbled and it was all absolutely Victorian feathery writing.
And they probably weren't in the right order either.
Oh no, none of them had a year on them, of course, because you don't do that when just the dates. And but it was a massive joy to spend so much time in my family's company. And there's nobody to ask, but to learn all of these things and just tiptoe forward. And so, the book comes out in October. I want it to be a book that people just go, I bought you this because there's some really interesting things about women in conservation. Or I bought you this because do you know that Lily Parr is the only female footballer of whom there is a statue. And that it's why I knew that the FA had actively stopped women's football. It wasn't the women who never played football. It was the most popular sport in Britain during the First World War. And it became too popular. And the FA said, well, you can't play in professional grounds anymore. So they actively stopped the game. And so it's just, for me, this is what history is. It's about, you think you know why this happened, but actually it happened for this other reason. And I've had great fun doing it, really great fun doing it. And in fact, I mean, we haven't announced where yet, but in fact, I'm doing a theatre tour next year.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Music, a lot, I'm not singing or dancing. No, don't worry. But yes, because again, it's about that. And I do think, what can we do when we listen to some of the news? And, every woman and man I know is looking at what's going on in America or things going on here, going, this is terrible in all sorts of areas. Obviously, the area of women's rights is my area, but for other people, there are many other things as well. And the only way that most of us can make any difference is to just keep shouting about the good stuff, is to just keeping that difference and saying, we don't all think like this. And that's why within the book is very, very global and very diverse, because of course, all the conversations that are happening around anything have been happening for millennia, obviously. And that's a good reminder as well, that is back to the thing before. It's not necessarily finding answers. It's about learning to ask the right questions.
You've written about people who've done small things, big things, but I like Florence Boot, who
agree.
She was contemporary of Lily, and she assisted her husband. And I thought, I love the idea of being able to go in and get my vitamin C tablets and then go and borrow a book. That she started a lending library. There's so many little gems in there.
Yes. And the thing is, of course, what happens is then someone will say, oh, have you got such and such in the book? And it'd be, oh, no. And that's why we say nearly 1,000. Not entirely sure, because some of the way I've got a lot of people in the book, there's not pen portraits of everybody. But, one of my favorites is Kutulin, who is the Mongolian princess, a contemporary of my fictional character Alais, but she of course is the great granddaughter of Genghis Khan. And the story that goes, and she was a real person, but she said absolutely she would get married if the man could beat her in a wrestling match. Now this sounds odd, except wrestling is Mongolians' national sport and everybody does it, men and women. And if he lost, he had to give her, some say 1,000 horses, some say 100, some say 10,000. And she ended up with the biggest herd of horses. She was the biggest horse owner anywhere in the world, because nobody could beat Kutulin in a wrestling competition. And I loved that bit of the story, but I also loved the interesting thing. You several times have used the word strong women. I just write women. We're all like this. So the idea that there's women and then there's strong women who are slightly not the same as other women because they're competent to do things. I would say we're women. And so with that story, Kutulin was this strong, physical, fighting woman. The story got kind of diverted and diverted and diverted and diverted until the end she becomes the Turkish princess. And who is that? Puccini's Turandot, who is a pretty creature sitting with flowers, not a woman wrestling the man to the ground. And that again is really interesting, the idea of what femininity is, about what is valued in female stories. So there are loads of those, and some of these will appear in the show. And my hope is that there will be a big social media campaign around it, that we will, every single person who reads the book or borrows the book or buys the book will add one more woman to it. We'll say, have you heard of this person? So this book isn't to stand separate from all the other books in this area. This book is to say, let's keep the conversation going, and every single person who likes the book to add a new woman. And then we're going to end up with 10,000 women, and that will be amazing.
Yeah. Just thinking of all the things you've done. You've been a governor, Chichester High School for Girls, on the board of the National Theatre, sit on the executive committee of Women of the World, Professor of Contemporary Literature and Creative Writing at the University of Chichester. Kate, the list goes on and on and on.
Don't do them all at the same time.
If you want something done, give it to a busy person. You've been very busy. And on top of that, as you mentioned, you've been a carer for your parents and also for your mother-in-law, which is a full-time job in itself. And the whole topic of caring, which we're not going to have time to go into. And you wrote An Extra Pair of Hands. But going back to you being such a busy person, to what do you attribute your ability to achieve so much in a day?
I'm tempted to say coffee in the morning, wine in the evening, but that's a flippant answer. Well, I'm really lucky. I am healthy. I don't have any long-term health issues. and I haven't had to cope with serious illness or any of those things. And that makes an enormous difference by the time you get to your 60s. But everything that we've talked about, I had two parents who, our house was always full of somebody coming to a committee meeting or stuffing envelopes or going, to do a collection for something. And I think it's that sense that it's not just about you. It's about all the other things that you do. And I do a lot of small stuff. That's the point, that it was wonderful to be the deputy chair of the National Theatre, and I had a fantastic time, and I love being on the executive committee of Women of the World. But I'm equally proud to be the president of the Festival of Chichester, because I come from here, and this is my home. And that's what I learned from my parents. It's not about all this big bells and whistles stuff. It's about just do your thing. And again, I am a full-time carer, but it's a privilege. I love my mother-in-law very, very dearly, but I also have an incredible husband. My brother-in-law lives with us. My sister's around the corner. Again, I am lucky that there's a network of people. We're all doing these things together. There are many people, carers particularly, who are doing it on their own. They don't have any support at all. They might even have had to give up their job in order to be a carer. I don't have to give up my job to be a carer because I sit here at this desk. And Granny Rosie has come in once. You haven't seen her because she's out of shot, because she's now superly overdue for her gin and tonic.
Oh gosh, yes.
I can see that's why she's come through. Like, she's looking hopefully in her little face around the corner. Because she's in a wheelchair. I can hear her coming. See, this is the point. So, and I think it's things like that many people have an enormous number of challenges, particularly people who are caring for somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's or some other kind of neurological decline. And these things make an enormous amount of difference. So I haven't got a lot of those things to cope with. So there's not much excuse for not getting on with writing a book. It will be late. It always is late. Every new book is late. I think also because success came quite late for me. I was an overnight success at the age of 45 with Labyrinth, which meant that my life was pretty settled. And I can very clearly remember standing in Tesco's in Bognor Regis, which is where we lived at the time, with my two children and seeing Labyrinth at number 1 and thinking, well, who'd have thought that? And so I still feel I'm very grateful for that. And that gives you a lot of energy. I don't take
it for granted.
No, I think that's the thing.
I was going to ask you a series of quick questions. One was going to be your most proud moment, and I wonder whether that might have been it. But if you could describe one of them.
Actually, my proudest moment was managing to read the poem at my mother's funeral. The fact that I finished that, actually. I didn't think I was going to make it, but I did. And she would have been really cross if I mucked it up. And a friend of mine, actually, who was my editor, in fact, who was in the audience, she said, the thing is, your mum will already be up there rearranging chairs. And that was exactly what it felt like. Don't muck up my eulogy, darling.
Okay. What about a low moment and how you recovered?
I have to work quite hard not to brood. If I think I've mucked something up or did the wrong thing, like a lot of people, I'm very good at waking up at 3 a.m. and re-picking. And so I consciously try to, it's going to sound terribly American in that kind of way, but I do try to always find a lesson out of something, even if it's been a bit of a disaster. And, for me, the low moments are ones of loss in the end. However, I've had loads of disappointments in my writing career and in my professional career when things that we thought were going to happen, or films were going to happen, they didn't, or television series that was going to. But none of that matters. The only things that really matter are those moments of great joy, but also loss and despair around the people that you love and you care for. And so it's those, that the loss of my parents was very significant for me. Not that they came in the wrong order or the wrong time, or that they were snatched away, but they just were enormous things. And I suppose one of the things that has been the most extraordinary was knowing my daughter had had a baby, knowing that it was okay, and not having realized and not having read much about what it feels like to be a parent, knowing your child is going through that and not knowing if it's all right. And I've just been saying to all my friends who are grandparents, you didn't tell me that the waiting was just awful. Nobody, and everybody said exactly the same, but you can't.
No, because you can never know until you're in it. You can't prepare.
Because you haven't had that yet, but you have a child, so you know all these feelings. So all of that. So I would say that that's the thing, that low moments are about loss, really, rather than anything else. Because in the end, I just write books. And of course, it's really disappointing if something doesn't work out. But it is, in the end, just writing books.
And if you could give aspiring writers just one piece of advice, what would it be?
5 minutes a day is better than no minutes. I think what all writers do is quite rightly say, I haven't got time. And what they're saying is, I haven't got time to write the novel that I want to write. But everybody's got time to write, even if you are like I am, a full-time carer. If you have a pad and paper by the kettle, you can write a description of steam while you're waiting for the kettle to boil. And if you therefore write all the time, you take away the fear of the blank screen or the blank page. And it's like getting fit. It's like doing your warm-up exercises before you run the marathon. You don't just go, I'm going to run a marathon today. I've never run before, but I'm just going to give it a go. So I think that that regularity to take the edge off it, so that when you do have the free hour, the free 2 hours, the free 2 weeks, your muscles are ready for it. You're good to go. There's a lovely saying, which you probably know, is attributed to Picasso. And he is supposed to have been asked towards the end of his life, when he was the world's, if not the greatest living painter, certainly one of them, by a young student, why he still went to his desk every day. And he said, when inspiration arrives, I want it to find me working.
That's absolutely brilliant. And having researched all these amazing women, what advice would you give to women, not about writing, just about living life?
Stand your ground. I'm a positive campaigner rather than a negative one. I don't like all of the, let's complain about this, let's complain about that. I think complaining gets you nowhere. I think if you need something changed, change it. Do something. I would say to all women, be confident in yourself. And that means that if you want to be and are in a position to be somebody who is at home with your children, and that's great. Do that. If you want to be out at work, do that. Women are encouraged to criticize other women's choices, because divide and rule works. It always has. But if we as women just stand shoulder to shoulder and respect one another, even if we fundamentally disagree, then it's back to Catherine de Medici and Jeanne d'Albret, 2 women who hated each other, but they got together to see if they could bring peace to France, which had been in religious civil war for 10 years. Now, obviously, none of us are going to have that kind of level of anything, but I just believe that sisterhood works. And I think that all men and boys benefit from that too, because many men and boys don't want to have to play the roles that are assigned to them either. So let's just put a bit of common sense back in. We all share this world. Let's do it fairly.
Last couple of questions, I promise. To unwind at the end of a busy day, because you have them, what's your favourite thing to do?
Granny Rosie and I do sit in the kitchen at the end of most days, and she'll have a gin and tonic, half a glass of wine, and she'll be half reading crossword clues out, and I'll be reading a detective story.
If you were able to take a 2-week holiday and you could only take one book with you, what would it be?
Oh, it would be Wuthering Heights. It's a book that changes every time you read it. Most ambitious, extraordinary novel. It's a book about race. It's a book about obsession. It's a book about landscape. It's a book about Victorian hypocrisy. The one thing it isn't is a love story, but it's just a book that is so extraordinary that I could pick it up and start at any point in the book.
And last question, most important daily habit?
Walking. Partly, I think, because I'm a carer to Granny Rosie, who is in a wheelchair, and it was incredibly active, very sporty woman when she was younger. And I know how much she really hates the loss of that. I find whenever I'm feeling a bit wound up or worried about something, or I can't get, the writing's not going very well, or I'm anxious about, somebody's ill or whatever, walking always makes things better.
Well, Kate, thank you so much for your time. How lucky am I that I was reading your novels, and when you do read someone's novels, you think, I wonder what they're thinking about that, and I wonder what they do that, and I get to ask you. So I'm so lucky, and I am going to take away the fact that you are such a positive person, and that you are changing things by not complaining, by not criticizing, by just thinking, if I don't like something, I'm going to just get up there and do something about it, which I think is so powerful. I know that in that annual Women's Prize for Fiction, when you set it up, you had a lot of praise and a lot of criticism as well for it, which I find extraordinary, actually. But you just carried on doing what you believed in, which I think is something that we should all do a little bit more of. So thank you so, so much. I've had such a lovely time, and good luck with the book. I shall be, well, I'm giving it to everybody now, men and women.
Excellent. No, it's been a great pleasure, Katie. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you. You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to Matthew Passy and all at the Podcast Consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.